we are porous. And that porousness avails us of the same pollution that's affecting the frogs and the rivers. But it also opens us up to nourishment and communication from these beings as well. How, when we come together in therapeutic settings and healing settings and bodywork settings, can we understand that we are two ecosystems creating like a shoreline together? We're bringing all of our baggage, all of our birds, all of our microbes, and it's that place of relationship where we overlap that is going to create the beauty.
Welcome everyone, and thank you to those of you that have been joining the membership recently. Our next Soul Space is taking place on April the 22nd, and we would love to welcome more of you listening into the community space. Being a member really supports this work financially and also energetically. If you have ever been moved by or learned something from this podcast, please head to allthatweare.org/support. My guest this week is Sophie Strand, who we had in episode 147 with Bayo Akomolafe as part of the Reimagining Education Conference, which will be happening again at the end of April. Sophie Strand is a writer based in the Hudson Valley who focuses on the intersection of spirituality, storytelling, and ecology. Her first book of essays, The Flowering Wand, Rewilding the Sacred Masculine, was published by Inner Traditions in fall 2022. Her eco-feminist historical fiction, Reimagining of the Gospels, The Madonna Secret, comes out in summer 2023 and is available for pre-order. She once said, "I'm much more interested in ensoilment than ensoulment. I want to have actual roots. I want my spirituality to have pheromones, funk. I want it to live in a specific place. And I want it to teach me intimately how to be dynamically present and useful to my ecosystem. And I want to tell people that healing isn't about completion, and it isn't about lightness. It's about the mixing bowl where nothing is exiled, everything is included. In order to grow a garden, you need manure, you need compost. In order to heal the soil, you don't clean it, you add to it. Fungi, ferment, bacteria, wood chips. Researching Rabbi Jesus, Yeshua, for my ecological reimagining of the Gospels, I realized the folk magician's real teaching was not purification. He ultimately even rejects John the Baptist's water immersions. In a time period where people were traumatized by Roman imperialism, diseased and obsessed with purity rituals, he offered something radical. His offering was to brush the question off. Who cares? Come and eat with me. Come and share a meal. He purified not by cleaning, but by including. Everyone was invited. No one was exiled. These words of Sophie's speak to the heart of this conversation, where we call parts of you back from exile, and we ask you to look into your own community of who may be exiled in your life that you can call back. It's beautiful to be sharing this conversation as I am on my way to the beautiful leadership retreat that I am hosting, where we will be both exploring embodiment practices and energetic practices that allow us to connect more deeply to our own roots. And we will also have our hands and our feet in the soil. It's actually rainy, wet, muddy soil that we'll be landing into at 42 acres. I am so looking forward to the nourishment of bringing a group together and exploring the principles of beautiful leadership, along with this time to tree whisper and to tend to the ecosystem that we are part of. In this conversation called Compost Heap Wisdom, we explore the themes of ecological embodiment, new myths, and healthism as we speak to the question, how can our stories be useful to our communities and become life-saving myths and ecologies? I hope this conversation allows you to compost something and tend to your inner and our collective soil. Welcome to All That We Are, with me, your host, Amisha Gadiali. On this show, we explore the weave between activism, the sacred, creativity, and regeneration, the spaces where our inner and outer worlds dance. From healing trauma to nature connection, to new technologies to ancient wisdom, it's time for us to move beyond silos and into an integrated way of being. Every one of us has ideas and personal experiences to share that can lead us to a more beautiful future. Despite the challenges we face as a global community, or the pressures we meet in our daily lives, when we stop and dare to listen, to ask ourselves the big questions, and to share what we are already doing and envisioning, we create the futures of our wildest dreams. And we begin to embody all that we are becoming, and all that is possible. Sophie, I am delighted to welcome you back to All That We Are. Last time it was part of Reimagining Education with Dearest Bio. Yeah, I've been looking forward to us finding the right moment to sit down and go deep together.
Me too, especially as I was telling you before we started to record, I've listened to so many of these episodes and really benefited from them. I'm also happy, the last time we spoke was the first time I'd ever spoken with Bio and in person, and you have to be extra caffeinated to do that. So I'm also glad to be here in this less heightened state.
I would love for us to create a new myth today and explore a new landscape together. As we go into that, I would love for you to share with us what are the futures of your wildest dreams, whatever that means to you.
So one macroscopic dream, collective dream is, we're so devoted to human stories and to human survival that every species eventually goes extinct, that evolution is creative, but it is not nostalgic. I think I'm taking that from Thomas Halliday, the paleontologist who wrote this great book, Other Lands. Evolution is not nostalgic. It's creative. It wants to keep creating life. And so the future of my wildest dream is that I participate and everyone participates in the continued aliveness of the earth without being overly coupled with the idea of human survival. How can we begin to really generously feed our lives, our creative work, to the preponderance of species, to biodiversity, and not just to simplistic ideas of what is supposed to happen? So that's a dream I have. And then personally, I have a wonderful group of friends, and we do, quarter year celebrations, and we had an equinox celebration at that moment on my friend's wonderful piece of property with these big oaks and there are black snakes and ghost pipes and all sorts of wonderful beings on that property that I've communed with. I felt my next fiction project drop in. I've been known for nonfiction, but my real love is storytelling, is fiction. And I felt my next fully developed fiction project come in like a seed. So one future I'm also dreaming towards personally is world building, to create, a world that's lush and nourishing, that it's a story that could save someone's life.
I love that. The power of stories. Can you share a little bit more your understanding of how a story can save someone's life?
I have two different tacks. So one is the more anthropological lens, which is that for most of human history, knowledge transmission has been oral, and it has been nested in narratives that are compelling enough that people want to retell them. It's very hard to remember a list or like a lineage or a set of rules for how to farm and how to honor the seasons and where to go at what time of year. But it's very easy to remember a good story. So stories have actually been like arcs, they're boats of breath, where you plant the most important ecological wisdom, cultural inheritance in them, and then you keep them alive by retelling them. So stories are like maps of relationship in place. They can become a map of all of the different species, the ways you tend to those species, to each other. So stories are the way we keep knowledge alive for most of human history. And that's pretty powerful. But in another way, I love the story of Scheherazade. which is the frame narrative for the Arabian Tales, that she is the vizier's daughter and married to a king who marries a new woman every night and then kills her in the morning. So she knows that she has to tell a story compelling enough each night that he wants to keep her alive the next night to keep telling it. And so that's storytelling that's adrenaline fueled, that a lot of queer people, that a lot of women, a lot of not white people understand, which is like, you're in a situation and you have to tell a story that's compelling enough to keep you alive. That's high stakes. That's real. And for me, that's the kind of storytelling I want to tap into, which is not MFA lit, not your little slender novella with 3 characters living in a city, but like, what is the story that keeps you alive, that matters to you so much? And I think that if you can find that story in your life, it will probably save one other person's life. And that matters. I was a child who I experienced violent abuse very, very early on. And one of the things that saved me was stories, were adjacent possibles, were worlds where harmed children were magical and alchemize what had happened to them. And I could escape into those stories and they could provide me with alternative ways of managing violence. And so, yeah, this really matters to me. Were there books or stories that meant a lot to you when you were a child?
So I find it hard to answer because the way in which my memory works,
Yeah.
which is where something that I might have loved and recited, it doesn't stay in my brain for that long. But yeah, I mean, I definitely have some very visceral memories of my father's storytelling. The stories that he would tell about his childhood, or stories that he had, translated from what he was told in India as a child. And of course, all of the mythology of India has been an important part of my adolescence and also, more recent years. I love those myths and the different elements that you can draw from them.
Yeah, there's such a rich ecosystem of stories in India and in Hinduism. I studied that briefly in college. I just like dipped in and I was like, there's so much here. But yeah. And then I realized I needed to probably go back and take responsibility for my own ancestors who had some pretty tricky stories. But yeah, it's interesting. I think that it's one of the most powerful things we can do is go to our elders, go to our parents or grandparents and say, what are your stories? Like, what was your childhood like? What stories did you tell? 2 generations back, it gets harder and harder to remember the people who survived to bring us here. And it used to be that we were good at remembering and honoring the ancestors because we had a tradition of storytelling, of gathering together and telling the stories. So I always like to invite people to, go to your grandparents and record them, record their songs.
Yeah, absolutely. As someone who doesn't have like living grandparents and I don't have a well parent either, I really miss those. I miss the songs. I miss the nursery rhymes, like when my dad would sing Gujarati nursery rhymes to my nieces when they were babies. And, and I'm like, how do they go? Like it's so important to capture and honor and share and pass down and make different aspects of what we were given part of our lives. I've done that with Diwali and other kind of Indian, Hindu based, but Indian holidays where I realized at some point that if I didn't find a way to celebrate them with the people in my lives, then, I wasn't being taken to Diwali parties of older generations anymore. And so, I found my own way of doing it with food and meditation and sharing of myths and lighting of candles and giant sparklers. That there's like a kind of a whole kind of thing that I like to do to bring people together for those times. And yeah, as we talk about stories, there are moments where my nieces will say, especially the youngest one, she'll say, Mishi, can you tell me a story now from your own heart?
Oh, that's so beautiful.
Yeah. And then you're like, wow. And then you just start speaking and suddenly, there's an owl and the owl like flies out at night with a little girl on her back and you don't know where they come from, but we all have them in our hearts.
Children are so creative. They have something called like lateral thinking that adults can't do as well. They can make connections between things that we wouldn't normally think were connected. It's very creative. And I think that telling stories with younger people can be so good for our brains that it can activate our more creative intuition.
Yeah, absolutely. And that also perhaps some of the self-consciousness that could come in if you're in a group of adults, that doesn't seep in because you're just wanting to create an experience for that little one in your life.
It's also interesting. I think the same is true with animals. I mean, as a child, I loved telling stories. I didn't like writing stories down actually, but my parents had a hammock and we lived in the woods and we had a lot of geese that we had rehabilitated that we had like saved from like foie gras farms. And, we were animal rehabilitators. We had geese, we had ducks, we had cats and dogs. And I would sit on the hammock and I would tell stories to my little like conference of geese. And I think even when I'm writing today, I try and summon that sensibility. Like, am I writing for the birds? Am I writing for my interspecies audience?
Can you share a little bit more around what that means for you?
Well, the first thing I will say is I don't think humans are the virus. I think humans can be profoundly useful. And that if we look at many different indigenous cultures worldwide, we can see the ways in which we fall into an ecological niche. And like a bee going to drink nectar from a flower, we're incidentally pollinating things, that we find the ways in which we become, like our usefulness is manifold. And so I do think that humans can be part of this story. But I also think that this idea that human survival has to be built from the death of other beings, and that we know best, we know how to manage ecosystems, we know how to manage the deep time fluctuations of carbon and temperature, that feels hubristic. And I think a lot of, colonial conservation seems problematic to me. I'm always trying to embed us in a deep time story and to suggest that our comic streak human lifetimes are not long enough to see the full scope of the narrative. That things that are happening right now that may seem bad are actually the dynamic homeostasis of the earth trying to correct what we've done. And we should be more humble about our kind of techno optimization. That technology and human supremacy seem to be a really nasty combination right now. And to summon our mutual friend Bio, the times are urgent. We must slow down. How can we begin to ask in a really slow, careful way how we can be useful to our specific assemblages of beings? And then that's another thing is when we cast ourselves as the main character, as the main species, we start thinking about big fixes rather than actually embedding in our local environments and thinking about small fixes. And I think small fixes are actually the most important thing right now, which is, what's happening to the rivers, what's happening to the forests, what's happening to the impoverished people in your area, to the homeless people. Can you do things that don't photograph well, that don't, that you can't broadcast to the world? That's where the important activism is, the important storytelling, the important work. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean it's wild where we are. I was talking to a friend yesterday about just places to live, like around here, that there are certain villages where the glyphosates are making people quite sick. I've just had that experience. I didn't know what was happening at the time. And then since then, I realized what it is. And so then as I've been looking for other places to live, I was sat with a friend, oh yeah, don't go to that village because people are trying to move out of that village. And then talking about, the rivers and don't put your head under, that's where we are, that we're having to kind of manage this complex relationship with the toxicity around us.
My grandmother actually, she was English and she moved to America. Well, her mother was English and she lived between America and England, and then she settled here in Cape Cod. And she planted roses, but she was a big rose gardener. And she used Roundup and she died of complications from lymphoma. And she was part of the case against glyphosate and Roundup. And, we didn't get a lot of money, and it doesn't really make up for the fact that she died, but she was my favorite person in the whole world, pretty much. And yeah, glyphosate killed her. on every piece of food now. I have neurological reactions to it. I can't eat anything that's not organic. Anything that has glyphosate on it, I eat it, and I'm sure you understand. Like, I can tell immediately. It's both painful and also important to realize that we are porous, and that porousness avails us of the same pollution that's affecting the frogs and the rivers. But it also opens us up to nourishment and communication from these beings as well. And especially for people who are like you, like me, who are dealing with some level of physical illness, that it's a heightened experience of porosity. It's much more complicated than our simplistic value dualisms of good and bad. That porosity it's a complicated tool.
Well, as you're speaking, it's like I can feel the beauty and tragedy are on the same knife.
Yeah, exactly.
And especially the story of your grandmother, that she is there tending to these beautiful roses.
Beautiful
That
roses.
she's creating something that's so fragrant and such a delight for everyone around her to experience the roses.
And it was killing her. I know, I think about that all the time. Oh, and I also think I want to summon, I'm gifting pigweed to you. So pigweed is native, I think it's traveled to Europe accidentally, but it's native to North America. And it's considered a terrible weed. It's deep taproot, destroys monocropping, and it genetically outpaces Roundup. It digests Roundup, and you can't get rid of it with pesticides. It's resilient to pesticides. It used to be a staple food of a lot of the different Eastern tribes before colonizers came in, but we've decided we don't eat it. We've decided it's a weed. They can only get rid of it with flame cropping, which is basically like burning the land. But it is so good at correcting around pesticide. And so when I think about my own body and how I feel like anywhere I go, I'm reacting to this pollution that's just everywhere, I say, Palmer Amaranth, help me outpace this. Help me manage it. Help me be a weed.
And do you find that you can connect to the spirit, to the soul of the plant?
I do. Well, the craziest thing is I was reading about it. I was calling on it in my prayers. Like, in medieval culture, you would call in certain saints to help with certain issues, St. Lucy for eyes, St. Peregrine for certain types of illness. And I would call on Palmer Amaranth when I would be having these migraines and these weird neurological effects that I knew were pesticide based. And then I looked outside my door, and growing up against the building next to me was a giant Palmer Amaranth.
Wow.
And yeah, I felt that was pretty spooky.
Yeah, beautiful.
Do you have any allies, any plant or fungal or animal allies that guide you right now?
Yes, I mean,
A lot. Yeah.
Absolutely. Both ones that I take in tinctures and ones that I like to surround myself with. And yeah, and even just simply going and resourcing myself with a lot of we have these really beautiful old ancient trees in England everywhere.
Yeah. I'm jealous. I have to be honest. I see pictures, and we just have such juvenile forests here.
And with the trees, they embody the deep time that you were speaking of. And so whatever I'm dealing with, they've been here long before, and they'll be here long after me, They have that ability to hold and anchor a deeper wisdom.
Yeah. I think about mirror neuroning with other humans, and how, you can also imitate someone else's movement so that you can understand their internal emotional state. So true with trees. I find it works for me better with trees, which is if I just imitate a tree, touch it, anchor my body to it, I can find an internal state in me that's much steadier and less reactive. That there's something about actually physically being with the tree that helps me to regulate my nervous system.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose what we're speaking about here is the beauty and the tragedy of being really porous. And so for me, it's very easy to connect in with the soul of something. Another one of my allies always is rose. I have this really beautiful rose that is an organic rose from India. And the smell of it just lifts everything emotionally and spiritually. I just feel this lift into another sphere. I've started to gift and sell it to my friends. It's that like, what is that?
Yeah.
Like, it's really
Yeah.
got this like potency to it. And yeah, so that sensitivity and that ability to connect, it's not so possible from my understanding that we can only connect to what's like quote unquote good.
Oh, it's also to the darkest parts. Yeah. My experience of violence as a young child was of extreme porosity with the worst parts of humanity. And it's made me more keyed to it in the world, to that type of violence, that I feel like I can always smell it, taste it, pick up on it. We're porous, we're threaded through with microplastics. Every lungful of breath is threaded through with Mesozoic ferns that are churned into exhaust. That, we're breathing in ancestors, but they're complicated ancestors. And how do we begin to live with a more complex idea of what purity is? Yeah, I don't think I believe in purity anymore, or in high vibration. I don't know. It doesn't really map onto the complex embodied experience I'm having as someone with an illness with no cure. My body is never going to be pure. My intentions are never going to be pure. And how can I just be aware of that?
Yeah, this is such a powerful space. And I feel like this is where there's a potentiality for a new myth, for something new.
Yeah.
One of the things that has been deeply like troubling me over recent years is understanding how so much of the perspective that's been offered to me through modern spirituality is these kind of narratives of, you create everything and everything's a mirror of something in you. And I feel like it can lead to such violence. I'm not like shirking that there's any kind of unhealed part of me or of other people or any kind of responsibility, but this over like individualizing at a time when we know that there is chronic ill health in our environment, in our ecosystems, in the way that we operate, that we choose as a human species to operate. And so, of course, those of us that are porous are feeling it and experiencing it. And I feel like sometimes a lot of the kind of narratives that exist there in the coaching world or in the like, the psychedelic healing world or in, the optimization kind of narratives, it's like you quote unquote like should just be able to like pull yourself together and out and through this thing, whatever it is. And what I've been experiencing with my own health, but also watching my mother experience like a very difficult degenerative disease that I know is becoming more and more prevalent as well. And so, yes, there are reasons, there are triggers within her for why she might be experiencing it. And some of those are also to do with deeper systems of oppression and through which her life has been lived. And then there's also, a lot of it is to do with external factors that are showing up more and more in the world as we are experiencing it. Likewise, there's this prevalence of undiagnosed, like neuroinflammatory immune conditions and so many other things. And so I feel like this shaming that can exist and this quest for optimal wellness, if I could see it, it exists as like this weird, it's a shape kind of above reality. Like it's not enmeshed in and connected to everything.
Yeah, this is my main concern at this point, and which is this idea of healthism, which exists in both, Western medical paradigms and very intensely in New Age spirituality. I got mysteriously ill at 16. It took about 7 years to get a correct diagnosis of incurable genetic connective tissue disease. And in that time period, I was manhandled and mistreated by both Western medicine and New Age spirituality because I was trying anything. When you're sick, you're desperate. You'll try anything. I was constantly told that, it was my darkness. It was my problem that I wasn't going to get better.
You don't want to be better.
And let me tell you, as a survivor of, childhood sex abuse, you're like, oh yeah, of course, it's my fault. And it's always the vulnerable populations that are being told that they need to buy the program, that they're sick because they made themselves sick, rather than saying we live in a culture where oppression sediments in bodies that are not responsible and cannot in any kind of individual way tackle all of these different ways they are being influenced by their exposome, which is their external environment that then causes certain experiences in their body to manifest. It really drives me crazy. So the idea that the individual is responsible for their health, when the fact is that we're living inside cultures that create illness, and then suggest that you have to be financially and personally responsible for coming back into normativity and productivity, and that health and productivity are very, very conflated. I'm increasingly wary of wellness and wholeness. I've been haunted my whole life by this idea that I'm like a deviation from the norm, that there's a well me that wasn't abused, that didn't get sick, that didn't do that thing. And at a certain point, I had to realize that, I had to stop using all of my energy and money to perform wellness for people who are not uncomfortable with the illegibility of incurability, with illness, with pain, with sorrow. I'm not sure what wellness is at a time when we are living in environments that are so toxic that, butterflies can't reproduce, that the grass can't grow. Psychotherapy is honestly the thing I'm most interested in right now, how it presupposes that two people in a room can possibly solve all the issues that are caused by multi-species networks of oppression. How does that even work? And that expecting people to spend all their money and time on these small human interactions can't possibly be useful. I realize that this is pretty radical. And I am a person who comes from a family of psychotherapists and therapists and has done years of it, but I'm increasingly unclear as to how it can possibly untangle what's happening right now.
At least just alone, it's a very small piece of a much bigger puzzle.
Yeah, I mean, I love liberation psychology and the idea of like, how can we identify all of these different ways in which the culture, your environment have made your life more difficult, and look at that. And that feels liberatory.
Yeah, I mean, I also come from that background. My parents were psychiatrists and a psychoanalyst, and I went to an enormous amount of psychiatric and psychology conferences as a child. So have been deeply immersed in that world and then in the worlds of healing. And I do believe that there are processes that can be supportive, but it's so narrow, the field that it operates in both the world of mental health as a kind of, especially in a more public services kind of lens, or like traditional therapy, which isn't generally very embodied. And also in the spiritual world, which has also just become such a kind of, I don't even have the words for it. But, it's the sales and the manipulation and the needing to kind of prove that you can either solve all of someone's problems or make them rich, or both. For me, I feel that there's another way, like the people that I have that mentor me, or when I offer one-to-one work with people, it's not around trying to solve everything, or, or to kind of create that flip into like, suddenly I did that and then everything's different. And of course, sometimes that is what's experienced, because just a little shift can shift so much. But we have to understand that it's a very small part within something that is so much bigger, and that so much of it is a relating with a story that is so much bigger than us.
Yeah. So we need to go to each other for healing. We can give each other healing. How can we acknowledge that we are two ecosystems that are interfacing? I oftentimes think of ecotones. So it's, the shore is created by the interface of the sand and the ocean meeting. The hedge is created by the interface of the field and the forest. And these are places of extraordinary biodiversity where, ecotone, eco, household, tonos, tension, where tensions are held together. And I think about how when we come together in therapeutic settings and healing settings and bodywork settings, can we understand that we are two ecosystems creating like a shoreline together? We're bringing all of our baggage, all of our birds, all of our microbes. And it's that place of relationship where we overlap that is going to create the beauty. I don't know if you know the work of Jessica Dore.
No.
Jessica Dory is a friend of mine and an incredible writer and therapist, and also really thinking about new frameworks for storytelling in a therapeutic setting. And she offered to me, and in her writing, this idea of accompaniment of, like, especially with illness and with problems, instead of coming at them directly, how can we obliquely accompany them? How can we walk alongside people and begin to witness and give them some encouragement in a side by side way? And she used a lot of stories of Grail legends and of knights and their horses. And I thought that was such a beautiful way of thinking about it. Just like, how can you be the horse? Like, how can you like help the whole journey along?
I love that.
Yeah, I've been thinking about that, especially when I'm a problem solver, and that can be violent. I've had to understand that about myself, which is when someone presents me with pain, I oftentimes try and solve it. And lately I've been really trying to tell myself, I can't do that immediately. I should just try and walk alongside it. How can I do that?
Thank you for tuning in. If you are enjoying this episode, do join our membership. For a small contribution, you can be part of our community, where we deepen the conversation and offer spaces of learning and embodiment. As a member, you are a patron supporting the making of this show, keeping the episodes full length, free and accessible for all. And you receive a number of benefits, such as monthly soul space, going deeper sessions, access to our library of workshops, and discounts on all our online and in-person experiences. Our membership is what makes us able to make this show and stay advertising free in a world that is always trying to sell us stuff we don't need. Head to allthatweare.org/membership to find out more and join today. It's so hard for most humans to sit with pain and to witness pain in others. There's something that you wrote recently that I know has really touched a lot of people. And you talk about performing wellness to make other people feel better, and also demented hope. That really stuck with me.
Yeah, I mean, it's, as someone who has an illness that doesn't have a cure, that is degenerative, it's always very hard when people say to me, and I have people who are ill or have family members who are struggling with illness know this. When someone says to you, I hope you're feeling better, right? And what they're really saying is, I'm so uncomfortable with your situation that you have to tell me you feel better. Because if there's an outcome where you're not better, that opens up the portal to a world that I don't understand. It means that they're erasing the complexity of your experience. Suddenly you're not allowed to actually share how you're doing. And suddenly you have to perform for them and make them feel better rather than telling them what's actually happening. I was thinking, why does it make me so upset when people do this to me? I'm not feeling better. I won't get better either. So how do I talk about that? And I've been trying to get better at making people feel uncomfortable. I just saying, no, I'm not. Thanks. And then just letting it drop, but not being mean, just saying I'm not. And sitting with that, Donna Haraway's stay with the trouble. How can we stay with those moments of feeling discomfort and learn how to navigate it physically, emotionally, interpersonally?
I feel like we're so in very early stages of this in terms of our human ability, or maybe we were better at this before. I don't know.
I also think that we live in a kind of culture with amnesia, that we pretend as if, genocide hasn't happened, that there haven't been extinction events, there haven't been these massive dislocations and geological eruptions. I think also about many cultures had seen asteroid hits, volcanic eruptions, droughts. They knew that really bad things could happen. You had that baked into your religious, your cultural sensibility. But right now we pretend as if we should be safe all the time. There's this strange talisman of safety that I don't really understand. Being is not safe. Becoming new is never safe. Relating is never safe. And I think this idea of safety actually has atrophied our musculature for dealing with really hard things.
Yeah, absolutely. I wonder, when we lived in more multi-generational spaces and in deeper community, there would have often been very unwell people around us. In the culture that we're in, or certainly that I find myself in, it is a culture of wellness, of like showing up, and actually like a lot of judgment. And I was living in a community house last year whilst I was going through this deep illness, and also whilst my mother was really progressing in a horrific way, is the only words that I have for these degenerative diseases. And again, it's like, every time someone asks, like, how are you? How's your mother? It's like, the answer is more and more harrowing each time. The tolerance level is that I can put up with that for a day or two, someone else experiencing something like that. But to have that in someone's face, like constantly over a period of time, is really, really challenging. I just find it so disturbing because it means that there are so many people that are going through difficult things and they just kind of disappear.
That's something I've been thinking about so much. You're erased, you're exiled. I did a course last month for people with chronic or incurable illness with treatment fatigue, where we were all talking about the experience of being that one person at the party that is disturbing everyone else because their existence goes against the grain.
Yeah.
You're so sick, or you've lost someone, you're in grieving because you've lost a partner or a parent. Your existence like disrupts the vibe that you often will self-exile because that you won't go to the parties, you'll start pulling back. I've been thinking lately about how can I actually be a lighthouse? How can I go to these parties, into these places, and stand tall knowing that my existence will help someone who is out to sea and hiding come to shore? And that it can be really uncomfortable, and not everyone has the resilience and the energy to do that. But sometimes you go and you're the lone person who is disrupting the calm and the equilibrium so that you're showing other people. I always say this, you're only ever temporarily well. Everyone is going to be unwell or experiencing grief at some point in your life. And it's important that there are people who stand up and say, like, when and if that happens to you, I will be here. And I'll forgive you for being awful when you were well and everything was easy.
When you didn't know about that this world existed.
My favorite example, and this is my kind of like my code for this, is I went to a group of friends, met a new woman. We didn't really know each other that well. She's now one of my closest friends. I had been experiencing quite a lot of intensity, and I was definitely editing myself to have polite chitter chatter with her. And then she just dove in and was like, yep. And then I was hospicing my mother, and the feeding tube was infected, and her hands were like falling apart. And I was like, oh, okay, we can be real with each other. And we talked about that, which is like the feeding tube. Like, who at the party, if you bring up the feeding tube, is not going to get uncomfortable? Who's going to stay and say like, oh yeah, you can go to the dark. You can hold this. Yeah. So I'm trying to practice being that person who says the uncomfortable thing so that someone else can take their mask off.
I am that person.
Yeah. We both are.
I can't help it, but I don't always, it's not easy.
No, I think that's the thing, is it's a choice, and it's always uncomfortable. And usually people flee from it.
For me, I do it in it just is. It's like if someone asks, I'll just answer the question. I don't have the right filter to say, oh yes, no, fine. And then if they ask a bit more, I will share like some of the more graphic details so that there is like a deeper understanding. But I mean, it has led to a lot of exile. That is for sure. And that's okay. It's also possible that at another stage, those that exile there'll be a spark of something that ignites. And like you said, it does allow so many others to take off the mask. And even where my mother's living right now, it's a retirement village. So everyone is, older. And some of the really able-bodied residents, have been really upset that there are people there that need care, and saying, I thought this was independent living. And, and it's been really interesting because the people that run the retirement village have said, yes, it is independent living, as in we don't work for you all in your homes, but you're all welcome to live-in care or whatever you need. And I'm looking around being like, wow, anyone in this room that's saying this could have a fall tomorrow, or find that dementia kind of pops in. And so actually being able to be comfortable witnessing other people's pain, and with that, the fragility that we're also experiencing in a much deeper way in our ecosystems.
Yeah. Just always know that your life can change in an instant. Yeah. And that can make life so much richer. I actually find that it's like a psychedelic experience when I hang out with my friends who are sick. I'm sick, and I oftentimes create containers where other people who are dealing with this can come and share. It makes me feel so alive being with people who are really living with every cell. That, in some ways, I often think the healthiest people are the sickest people. They're absolutely present. Something I've been thinking about a lot is this: there's such a popular culture right now of psychedelics that we take an object and we get our heroic dose, and suddenly our ego's dissolved and we're better. I have to be honest, the people who tell me to do ayahuasca seem to be the least evolved people I know. Not that it's not a very helpful plant, but I'm always suspicious of this idea that, we can take a plant out of its ecosystem, take it, and then it to treat our individual problems, and then somehow it will work overnight. These things are slow. I've been offering lately that having a non-normative nervous system, having neurodivergence, having psychological issues, having illness is psychedelic. Some people can't order vomiting for 10 hours and having ego death off the menu. Sometimes people just get it. There's a kind of enforced presentism to pain and to illness and to being with someone who's navigating it too that is profoundly psychedelic. The past no longer makes sense. You have no connection to it. There's no potential future. You don't know if it's going to happen. So you're forced to stay with experiences in this like highly abstract, wild way. And so lately I've been saying, yeah, okay, psychedelic culture is great, but there are a lot of disabled sick people who are having profoundly psychedelic experiences too that we are problematizing. So maybe we should ask them what insights and trips they've had.
I love that. In an ayahuasca setting, when you throw up, it's called getting well. And so all of the people that are throwing up through whatever else they are experiencing with their health, that they're getting well, they're processing something on behalf of our culture. If it's contained within that setting, it somehow has this whole deeper relevance somehow. And like you said, that is like ordering it off the menu. That's saying, okay, I'm going to go and do that.
Yeah, I mean, I've benefited from psychedelics, and I think they're profound beings that we can relate to in really complex, helpful ways. But yeah, I do sometimes wonder, there are a lot of people who seem to be ordering like their specific initiatory trauma experience when so many other people don't get to choose. I think about sensory gating a lot, which is psychedelics they open up your ability to receive all the stimuli that you're normally getting and gating out. And that also happens when you experience violence, when you experience pain, when you experience trauma, and you don't close those gates. So people who are hypersensitive through PTSD are also having a kind of heightened psychedelic state all the time. Something I've been struggling with is it's not that I would say I wish everyone was sick or everyone had these experiences. I want to actively work to make people feel better. So even as I say, don't say, I hope you're feeling better, I'm committed to helping people feel better. But I also don't want my commitment to them feeling better to become a burden to them.
Thank you for sharing that nuance, because it's so important. And that pressure, like you said, with the healing fatigue, because you try this treatment, you try that treatment, you try this specialist, you try this off the wall, like experimental something, and you put yourself through all of these different possibilities, and some of them help a bit, some of them don't at all, some of them are really expensive, some of them are not. Like it's a whole kind of process. But I feel like that pressure that people feel to get well, to take away the difficulty and to not be a burden, that's the bit that is deeply, deeply challenging.
Well, yeah, because if you think about, if we're stressed out, our immune system isn't going to work as well. And the stress to get better oftentimes undermines any of the attempts to get better. I think about that with me a lot. Something I've been trying to incorporate into my whole life is the idea of moments of healing jubilee. So the Jubilee year in Judaic custom is like a Sabbath year where you let the fields lie fallow, the slaves are all released, land is returned to original owners so that, one person can't hoard land. It's a reset. And it's a year where you just say the work is done, the work is complete, no more work has to be done. And then of course after that you go back. And for me, I can sometimes be so tired of treatment that I absolutely stop. And that's not good. I need to be keeping my ducks in a row and just trying to keep my body together. But I'm trying to work in Jubilee weeks and days where I can say, for today, it is enough. I'm just going to make a ritual. I'm going to make a meal. I'm going to celebrate what's here today and say, for today, it is enough. And I think we can create spaces for other people to do that. Or we can say, I think one of the issues is, and I'm sure you've experienced this, is when you share about your illness with someone, they immediately give you advice. And that can also make you not want to share because you're like, I've tried that. And so it's nice to create community where you say, no one is going to give anyone advice today.
Yeah, it's a balance, isn't it? Because it's also sometimes you're like, it's really good to hear the things that have worked for other people.
Well, yeah. And then you have settings where you're like, let's all exchange our toolbox.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Like I love hearing about things that have helped people with Parkinson's, or like, oh, there's this seat riser that you can get, or like all of those kind of things. It's really, really, really helpful. But of course, sometimes you're just feeling the grief. You're feeling the grief of either being unwell or caring for someone that's unwell, or maybe, maybe the bigger grief around our collective future and our collective unfolding.
It's feeling so intense these days. In the Hudson Valley in New York State, I'm very attuned to the seasonal fluctuations, and I've been noticing really wild changes in timing of birds' migrations and flowers and plants. But this year, we just didn't have winter at all. There was no punctuation. And it did something very strange to my organism. It was as if I didn't have some kind of internal punctuation, and it produced a sense of anxiety in me, like a physical anxiety that there had been no winter. And I thought, this is what all of the beings around me are feeling. They're feeling this low-level anxiety. That if people are anxious right now, it makes sense. We can pathologize anxiety, or we can say that it's the very natural outcome of an Earth that is well outside of its window of tolerance.
Yeah, there's so many things that we as humans and then every species is getting affected by.
Oh, and it's hard to know how best to navigate this, especially when the powers that be do not seem to want to change the direction at all. I think a lot about, have you read Barbara Ehrenreich's book, Dancing in the Streets?
No.
I think it's one of my favorite books at this point. It's a history of collective joy. It's really changing my way of thinking about healing, which is that healing happens when you put bodies together, like a lot of different bodies. If you're putting pressure on one body, it can collapse. But if you distribute that pressure through joined hands and through a network of people, through a web, suddenly it's much easier to hold. Like the pain of one person when distributed through a group can be held. She shows that collective dance, that rituals where people make music together, howl, recite prayers, and dance together are really powerful ways of moving energy that we don't understand how to metabolize. And I've been thinking lately that the only way to deal with eco-grief is through dance and through gathering. And gathering without a purpose to necessarily solve what's happening, but to just physically join hands and try and distribute this feeling.
Have you ever attended such a gathering?
I've attended like unofficial versions of it, but I've been trying to think about what it would look like to create that in my community. I used to do a lot of square dancing and community dancing when I was growing up, and it was funny, but I think that it could be poured into a wilder container and be really helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you feel how energy shifts and moves when we gather. And I imagine, much like the mycelium, like something happens within us that is way bigger than us. And I always feel it in retreats and I feel it in festivals and other gatherings.
I was going to say festivals, I think, are one of our modern ways of trying to recreate that. And especially with the musical element, it can be really effective.
Absolutely. And it doesn't even always have to be a gathering that has like spiritual intent, and just the bringing of people together and the shared experience of joy and physicality, that the embodiment part is so important to it, that you just feel a lightening happen.
I mean, I've studied Dionysus, and I'm always interested in how in many of these figures are associated with these kind of ecstatic rituals where there's fermented beverages. Maybe there are psychedelics, maybe not. Maybe people are just doing holotropic breathing together. Truly, it can, everyone's had that experience of just being with a group of people where the experience is so intense and so filled with love that it is like you're taking an inebriant.
Absolutely. Well, you co-regulate with the nervous systems that you're with. And so even in this experience, you and I are co-regulating with our dogs.
Yeah. Oh, I think about that with my dog all the time. It's been such a great way of me learning about my own anxiety. Because when he's anxious, I'm like, I'm anxious. And then I'm like, if I bring down my anxiety, I'll get more calm. I just like the most beautiful little feedback loop.
Yeah, and everyone that is listening to this is co-regulating into this field of nervous system texture.
I love that combination of words. One thing I'll also, you were talking about a new myth. I'm thinking about my favorite myth, not really myth, but story, is the compost heap, which is just where you bring your mess and you bring your problematic inheritances, your issues. You also bring the things that are delicious, the scraps from the dinner table from a good meal, and you all put them on the same pile. And without trying to organize outcome, everything mixes together to create good soil. That's how I create work, is I absorb, bad movies I see, conversations with my neighbors, brilliant books I've read, and all of that goes onto the compost heap and ferments into something different. But I also think that we can begin to come together like that, where we're not, we live in a culture that's become highly punitive. We're always policing other people's behaviors. And if you make a mistake, you're out. And, that's not how actual communities work. You can't cancel the person who you buy your bread from or who grows your food. You have to figure out a way to live alongside them. I'm interested in trying to create communities where we can bring our mess to the table and trust that if we all bring our mess, it will make good soil.
I love that. I love that. And it's so interesting. And so I'm curious as to what that internal shift is. There's like an internal shift that has to happen to make it possible to allow other people to bring their mess to you, to allow that composting to happen.
I think you brought up a really important thing, which is about having the self-knowledge to understand your own capacity. And that's what I think is really hard, is knowing how much toxicity you can engage with, and recognizing that your capacity changes just like your hormones fluctuate. That, maybe you're dealing with a lot of grief, you haven't gotten sleep, you're feeling really sick, you have a lot of work on your plate. Maybe you shouldn't make yourself available to that for other people. And you can be honest about that. And I think beginning to have kind of a self understanding of how your capacity changes makes you an easier person to be around. I would just create a blanket idea of how available I was and just pretend it was true all the time. I got much better at avoiding conflict when I started to recognize when I needed to go and be in a hovel and protect myself and not interact with people. And then there are moments in time when I feel very vital and I'm like, I can talk with that person who I know usually says something that's really hard to hear. My friend Luis Mojica talks a lot about, he has a great podcast called Holistic Life Navigation, about just beginning to recognize your shifting shorelines of capacity. And then when you talk about that with other people, they begin to notice it too. And everyone can begin to like have a slower way of communicating, being like, I'm very tired, not sure if I can do this. And then there are moments where everyone comes together and says, I feel great today. I'm ovulating. Like, I had a great meal and I think I can talk about something really difficult. Yeah, it's ecosystemic. And like when I say that, I mean, it has a lot to do with what we've eaten, who we've seen, what the weather is like. All of these factors are bringing us into being. That, we are less selves than we are interfaces between matter and other matter.
Absolutely. In this community house, we had the pesticides, we had the black mold. I was feeling them very physically, but they were in everyone's microbiome. Everybody was feeling them. And then it's like, oh, of course that shifts our availability. And I'm interested in this example just because I've lived it and just kind of where we're going collectively. We're heading into territory where we are potentially going to have less availability and more urgency. And so something has to shift inside of us in order for us to navigate that and still be able to be communal with it.
That's where the people who can practice this now practice it so that when things are urgent, you are available. And then I've been thinking a lot lately, like I've been making my coffee and sitting in the morning in my sunlit apartment thinking, this is fragile and this is not for long. So I should get as much nourishment as possible and store up my battery. So when there's no coffee and there's no sunlit apartment, I can draw on the energy from this moment. Recognizing that things may become very difficult in the future doesn't have to paralyze us. It can make us really suck the juice out of every moment right now. I'm not sure though. I don't have answers. And I do want to say that I live in a high state of ambiguity. That's what I've been really coming back to a lot recently, is that when we try and predict what's going to happen, we always make the wrong prediction and we have the wrong tools. And that for me, what I'm trying to get better at is improvising with situations that are outside of my control, because that's probably much more likely to happen. Can I be okay with plans changing? Can I be okay with people surprising me, with experiences interrupting my normal state of affairs?
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like there are these two aspects. There's the aspect around uncertainty and allowing ourselves to roll with a situation that is arising that is different to how we imagined. And then there's also this aspect that we've been talking about, but really inviting ourselves to be more comfortable with the uncomfortable, to let go of these notions of perfection and, everything being amazing all the time, and allowing that shift to allow ourselves to look at pain, at dissolution, at dying in a different way.
Yeah. And when we keep ignoring death, we keep ignoring the ferment of life. I oftentimes say death is the womb of life, it's the soil that, we live in the generous space left behind by decay. That's what Merlin Sheldrake says in Entangled Life. I loved that so much, which is if nothing broke down, if death didn't happen, everything would be swamped. It's even in our voice that, one syllable has to decay to make room for the next. That when we welcome death and discomfort back into our lives, we're actually welcoming back in the soil that can grow hardier bodies, hardier psychological capabilities. Decay is really, and death is the moment when life overflows its cup. You really enter life when you die, I think. To enter life, be food. One time, a deer was hit by a car and ran into my parents' backyard when I was younger. And it was really hot summer. And I went and sat with it every day. I was very sick at the time too. And meditated with this deer and watched as it melted and became maggots and fungi and flies and all sorts of things. And I thought, oh yeah, death is that moment when life is so much, when life is a party, that it's the moment when you become your selfhood, your idea of like a siloed, atomized self becomes much more riotous. We're all like one dance step away from falling into that festival. And you can't grow anything without that. So this is what I'll come back to. So food webs are what create a healthy ecosystem. One being's death and one being's shit is alchemized into the exact nourishment of another being. And so food webs are stitched together by death and by excrement. And I've thought a lot lately about how cities are absolutely insane because they abstract themselves from their shit. They offload it onto other communities who do not produce it. You flush your shit and it goes away and you never have to take responsibility for it. So we've become really good at producing really complicated shit, pollution, excrement, toxins, trash. And we've become very bad at fitting it back into a food web, figuring out how to make our shit food. And so something I'm thinking about a lot recently is like, how do we learn how to create food webs again? Where death, where our physical bodies can be fed back into these complex networks of appetites. It's hard to know, especially because a lot of us have been given nuclear medicines. Ground burial is complicated. This stuff is complex.
I love how we're being kind of invited to understand ourselves differently. And I feel for myself through the last years, I've had to let go of a lot, but it feels like what I've let go of, it kind of existed in this fake realm somehow anyway. It kind of existed somewhere that I couldn't touch, that I couldn't feel. It had been created through so much mental energy. And something that I feel now is like just so much of a deeper connection to the web that I'm actually part of. It's truly profound and beautiful, and it's deeply empowering, and it feels so connected, even though it involves letting go of so many ideas and so many kind of projections into the future that I might have had before. It's something I've heard you say before about spiders' webs, which is so beautiful and so interesting and really speaks to how what's inside our bodies is also outside of our bodies.
This is my favorite metaphor and also truth, which is that we've conflated minds with brains. But minds are perhaps not even contained in single cells, but are concatenations of cells, that they're territories that multiple beings inhabit. This is best demonstrated by how spiders create their webs and then they think with their webs. If you damage a part of their web, they act as if they've had a traumatic brain injury. Their minds are distributed through their whole web. And I like to think about what if we began to understand that our intelligence is not inside of us or outside of us, it's in our web of relationality with the insects, the microbes, the geological formations, the rivers that are in a 20-mile radius of our home. That our self is leaky, that it shares a root system with every being inside your ecosystem, that with every breath we take, we very materially, metabolically incorporate the spores, the funk, the microbiome of a place into our body. And that changes our chemical choreography, our very being, that we are only self through other. And that if we can begin to think of ourselves as extended into these webs, like spiders with their webs, we can realize that when we harm our environment, when we harm the beings in our environment, we're also harming our own bodies. So that's painful. And it goes back to what you were saying before, which is this sense of grief. I think there's an idea that coming into a heightened ecological awareness or embodiment is all pleasurable or all wonderful, but I actually think it's deeply painful. It's like when your foot has been asleep and it comes back awake and it's terrible, prickling pain. Like you have to cross an incredible threshold of pain.
Oh, like with pins and needles.
Yeah.
And then you can't walk on your foot suddenly.
Yeah. So I think we have to learn how to hold each other as we pass this threshold of pins and needles. When we come back into awareness that we are these webs, interspecies webs, we realize, oh, that part of my body's been harmed. That part of my body is polluted. That part of my body is lost a lover. And that level of pain is hard to hold. So I just always want to acknowledge that when you come back into that deeply rooted sense of place, there's beauty and there's also extraordinary grief.
The spectrum of life deepens and then everything feels more alive.
Well, yeah, it goes back to the body. I'm always very curious about how did we end up in this place where we're very attached to ascension narratives and to the idea that mind and matter are separate, that spirit and matter are separate, that intellect and matter. And in this state, this kind of disassociative state, I think in singular bodies, trauma sometimes registers as disassociation. The body knows pain, so you disassociate. And I think sometimes in cultures that have known genocide, drought, dislocation. There's also a cultural disassociation that I think over a long period of time has produced the kind of Euro-patriarchal mind matter paradigm and this disassociative state where we're always focused on the mental, on the material reductionist approach. But when we drop back into our bodies, yeah, there's pain there, but there's pleasure we have been denying ourselves too. So as we feel more with our bodies, we're just feeling more generally. We're opening up that window of possible sensation.
Yeah, it's truly profound.
I mean, all of this is hypothetical. We're all dealing with our, and then we don't demonize disassociation, which I think can be a trance technology. In different cultures, a person who's experiencing disassociation would be seen as a spirit worker, someone who can go to different worlds and have different experiences.
We demonize disassociation because it's so prevalent.
Yeah.
And because many people live in disassociation through addictions that we have and are so prevalent in our societies, and keeping that narrow middle ground. And it becomes a completely different thing if you can call on disassociation in that moment.
Targeted way, yeah.
Yeah. So it's not that it's a default place to live because there's no other alternative, but that, it's another tool, it's a practice. It's somewhere that you need to sometimes go to protect yourself or to receive a different perspective. Shambo really felt that. He was like,
I love it.
Yes.
This is a question I have a lot, which is when you were not aware, and this is in my own life, when I was not aware of how survival mechanisms were puppeteering my life, and I was just the passive recipient of them, and they were just putting me in terrible situations all the time, that was very disempowered. But when I became aware of them, and then also realized I couldn't get rid of them, I had a more interactive conversation with them. And I think it's about how can we bring awareness to the things that we do that we can't get totally rid of and start to be curious about how they could be useful sometimes. I'm still in an open discovery with that. There are certain ways that PTSD has manifested in my body that don't seem to ever integrate fully or go away. And how can I dance with them, get better at dancing with them? Because yeah, when I was fully disassociated in my life, that was dangerous and bad for me and for other people. How do we strike that balance where we gain some awareness?
Yeah, and to acknowledge that disassociation is also perhaps why you're still here.
I know, exactly. It's survival mechanisms. Very interesting. Something, and this is definitely on the very edge of what I usually talk about, is healing and surviving are different. And I think that sometimes we get so distracted with healing that we forget how to survive. A great example is I was doing a session with a body worker who was telling me about all the ways in which my body has incorrectly adapted to my dislocations in my bodies, all of my injuries and issues. And he corrected me. He put me in the correct position. And I was unable to walk or do anything for 2 weeks until my body went back into its incorrect adaptions. And then I was talking with someone who has studied human evolution, was saying that the body actually isn't built to be correct. It's built to keep moving forward. If you hurt your foot and you stop to take care of your foot, an animal is going to eat you. You're built to find a way to hobble with that foot forward to save yourself. And that was such an incredible reframe for me, which is to survive is to learn how to walk with the hobbled foot incorrectly. To spend too much time focusing on the hobbled foot is to be eaten by an animal. And I think we may be coming into a moment where we have to hobble to survive. We have to move incorrectly. And that there might be something that's useful about learning how to hobble.
That's really juicy.
I'm not sure if I totally believe this. It's just something I'm trying to think about in my own life, especially because I seem to be able to do more when I maintain these incorrect ways my body has adapted.
It speaks to the gently approach, and that's what we were talking about with psychedelics, right? As well, it's allowing for those gentle corrections, because I'm sure like within the hobble, like your body's also going to like start to pull it back. Your body does magnificent healing. And I have to say that sometimes I've had like an adjustment in a chiropractic or kind of sense, and it has just like clicked something. And I've actually just felt like a rush of more energy in my body. But it's a very deep skill to know how much and when.
Yeah, our culture is so bad at dosage. I'm very interested in the etymology of the word poison, that it's a modern word, that poison used to be much closer to pharmacon or potion, which is anything can be a poison based on dosage. That something at a very homeopathic level can be super helpful, but at a higher level can be a poison. So it's about context, the environment you're putting in. Any medicine we take, if it leaks, can become a poison to another being. We've lost the nuance that actually creates medicine because we just take too much of everything and do everything too fast all the time. That if we had a slower, more nuanced approach to substances and to also, healing therapies, we might have better results.
And that also comes down to what's been a thread through this entire conversation, which is the allowing of the unwellness and the allowing of the grief and the allowing of the pain. And so tending to it much more gently.
I want to return to something you said, which is the body is so intelligent and has such healing capability that I'm so interested in the fact that placebos are just accessing our intuitive immunological ability to heal. I heard Rupert Sheldrake say something very interesting about placebos, which is he said his theory, I don't know how much basis there is for it, but I like it a lot, which is that when we're stressed out, we have to take our energy away from, our extremities and from activities that could be draining our energy. We just need to focus on surviving. And because we live in such a high stress environment, we're always kind of narrowing our ability to heal ourselves. And that we're narrowing our immunological ability to respond to a lot of different hazards. And that if we figure out a way to live, we can open up that kind of placebo window and access that full range of bodily intelligence.
I want to give time for us to talk about your call to action because it's so rooted in your experience and also raising awareness of this condition. This particular condition, I've heard that Sia, the singer, has a recent diagnosis, and I know Jamila Jamil, the TV presenter and actress, she talks about it, and she gets a lot of flack for it, like not even being real and all kinds of horrific things. So can you share with us a little bit more around your experience and how we can support you through your call to action?
Thank you. So I have Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which is a genetic connective tissue disease. One of the complex things about it is it was very rare when I was diagnosed with it, and there seems to be a much higher rate of it in the past 5 years. There are questions in the medical community and the research community about environmental factors that might be turning on this gene in people. There are a lot of working theories that people could have had this gene and never had it turned on. Houdini, they think, had it. It may have caused his death. It causes vascular issues, aortic dissection, system-wide issues. And because your connective tissue is involved pretty much in every organ system. And as of now, there's no cure. There are ways you can manage it, but things begin to fall apart. You need spinal surgery, you need cardiac surgery. You kind of have to begin to navigate being a compost heap. It's so funny. I loved fungi growing up, loved them. And in college, as I was increasingly ill and struggling to find a diagnosis, I became obsessed with mycorrhizal systems, fungal systems that connect ecosystems, that are the connective tissue of the soil. And then I was diagnosed with a genetic connective tissue disease. And I realized that, part of the reason why Ehlers-Danlos doesn't have a cure is because it's rare and underfunded and under-researched, because not that many people have it. And fungi are also, they are not included in conservation attempts. They're not researched. They're considered kind of like the dark matter of science. And so it was an interesting moment where I realized, my lack, my insufficiency was actually a compass out of my own anthropocentric narrative into a connection with another being. So I always want to highlight Ehlers-Danlos and say, look it up, research it, get to know it, so that when someone starts talking to you about it, when you run into someone who has it, maybe you're that one person who understands. If you want to donate money to research, it really, really helps. But also just education is helpful. And education is helpful because you might be able to diagnose someone. A lot of people get their Ehlers-Danlos diagnosis because someone else says, that's, if you have postural orthostatic tachycardia, you should check this out. So it's also kind of like a network of helping people who have been struggling and haven't gotten a diagnosis. So, there's the Ehlers-Danlos network. You can look it up online. There are lots of ways to help out. But also, then there's the connective tissue of the soil. And I feel myself kin to that too. So, the work of Spun Underground and Fungi Foundation, you can choose your connective tissue. Maybe it's human connective tissue. Maybe it's ecological connective tissue. Thank you, Amisha. This has been really it's not many people I get to be this open with. So thank you for creating that space.
It's a real pleasure to be here with you and also to hold these spaces in general. I feel like this conversation, I have been more open than I usually am. Not that I normally hold back, but I feel like that what we're talking about, it's on the cutting edge of something that's coming into the fore. There are so many people that I know, speakers that have been on this podcast, that are going through very deep health challenges because we're coming from this culture where there's so much shame around that. For me, this disconnect that we're in around wanting some of the older notions of actually things that became popular in the 90s and the thousands, and they're still the noughties, and they're just still kind of ricocheting on. I'm just finding how some of that ideology coming together with where we actually are now, there's this mismatch, and people are falling through the gaps with this mismatch. And it might not be you, the person that's listening to this right now, but it might be someone in your world, someone in your life, someone in your network, someone in your family. There is talk around whether climate change is real or, whatever it is, or what's actually happening, and is the planet healthier or not. But I feel like if you just look at the people in your life and you see what are they going through, that you will find that there is more chronic illness, there are more terminal illnesses, undiagnosable illnesses, and that this is a real thing.
Yeah, I mean, rising rates of colon cancer in people under 30, just every day, more information. Canaries in the coal mine.
Yeah, so if this conversation can be a little ember of us coming into a new way of understanding ourselves and what it is now to be a human in this ecosystem, then it's a deep honor to be able to share some of the experiences. That's how it happens. It happens in our lives. It happens in the situations that we find ourselves in, these little microcosms, and they are part of the bigger narrative and the bigger story.
Once you broach a topic in a conversation that has felt taboo, it lets other people do it. So it's also kind of an allowing that goes back to what you were saying. I hope this conversation allows other conversations to happen.
Yeah. And I also hope that everyone that is listening to this or gets sent this, maybe somebody is struggling with something, that you're able to keep that openness to the mystical, to the interventions in all of the different ways that they come, and the discovery of a new ally in whatever form that comes, as well as being able to feel that solidarity with the not being okay.
Thank you, Amisha.
Thank you for listening. We hope that you have enjoyed this episode and it has sparked some inspiration and creativity in you. As always, you can find links to everything we mention in this episode, download our book, and discover so much more over on allthatweare.org. We give space to our guests to share their perspective without debating it or fact-checking, as this approach allows for deep, unedited conversations from the heart. We trust your discernment and wisdom to take what is useful and challenge what isn't in your own understanding. We offer spaces for discussion and integration in our membership community, which we would love for you to join. We don't believe in selling you things you don't need through this podcast, and so it's made possible by you, our beautiful community. If you loved this and would like to connect more deeply with us, please join our membership. You choose what you contribute based on our sliding scale, and you become a patron whose support makes this podcast happen, as well as receiving access to a library of many resources and invitations to nourishing events. Please also hit subscribe and leave us a review wherever you listen so others can find us. This podcast is made by an all-female global team. Me, Amisha Gadiali, producer and host, Anna Greta Folderbach, who crafts the words that accompany each episode, and Mary Chan, who edits the sound so skillfully. All That We Are celebrates all that we are already and the untapped potential that lives inside us. It invites the full power of the more than human world, nature, the unseen, our ancestors and our future generations. It reminds us that we never exist in silo, through borders, timelines, or polarity, that in each and every moment, all that we are is here.